And we continue. My name is Mr. Jed Keach, and we continue with the third chapter of Tigers in the Mud by Otto Carius. The chapter's title, The First T-34s. Another event hit us like a ton of bricks. The Russians showed up for the first time with the T-34. The surprise was complete. How was it possible that those at the top hadn't known about the existence of this superior tank? The T-34, with its good armor, ideal shape, and a magnificent 76.2mm long-barreled cannon, was universally feared and a threat to every German tank until the end of the war. What were we supposed to do with these monstrosities that were being committed in quantity against us? We could only knock at the door with the cannon. Inside, the Russians were able to play an undisturbed hand of cards. At that time, the 37mm anti-tank pack was our strongest armor-defeating weapon. If lucky, we could hit the T-34 on the turret ring and jam it. With a whole lot more luck, it became combat ineffective. Certainly not a very positive situation. Our only salvation was the 88mm flak. Even this new Russian tank could be effectively engaged with it. We thus started paying the utmost respect to the flak troops, who we previously had sometimes received a condescending smile from us. As if Ivan perceived our predicament, he started attacking in our sector for the first time with his "Ura! Ura!" At first we thought that our infantry were attacking with their own "Hurrah!" However, we soon knew otherwise, because Moscow was now almost within our grasp. In our opinion, the feeling began to sneak up on us that it was no longer possible to count upon a quick end to the campaign. I therefore had mixed feelings as I received marching orders to Erlangen and the 25th Panzer Replacement Battalion on August 4th, 1941. 3 days prior to that, I had put Unteroffizier Braid on the shoulder straps in my uniform. We tested for our truck and tank driver's licenses in Erlangen. Right after that, we arrived in Wunsdorf near Berlin to attend Officer Candidate Course Number 8. On February 2nd, 1942, I was informed that I had not met the standards of the course. Just like Gert Meyer and Klaus Wendelmeyer from our platoon, I clearly had not taken the whole affair seriously enough. Besides, there was one question I really shouldn't have asked. I thought I had occasion to confine my doubts to the blackboard, but my superiors didn't find the question, "Are reserve officers also human?" at all funny. Thus, we were still non-commissioned officers and officer candidates when we departed the course. In all actuality, we weren't too upset by it. The freshly baked lieutenants, after all, had to pull duty in the replacement units, while we were immediately transferred back to our old regiment. We were released with words of encouragement. Our tactical officer, whom we were all crazy about because he was a true character and led his charges with real feeling, said in departure that he was certain that we would obtain our goal soon at the front. There we could more easily prove our suitability to become officers. We wanted to prove him right. Even today I still think of him. I silently congratulated the Bundeswehr in its luck when I discovered that Oberst Philipp was the commander of the training regiment in Andernach. Chapter 4. Back with the old gang. We found the 21st Regiment in its winter positions at Gahapsk. It was horribly decimated. Only one company was still equipped with tanks. All other vehicles had been lost in the fighting during the withdrawal of the infamous winter of 1941-42. "We've been waiting for you," came the greeting from our comrades. "Now show us what you've learned." They smirked in a conspiratorial manner, and we sensed something was up. We received the mission to take over the snow shovel details. These had to clear the way through the terrain in front of the tanks during engagements in order to prevent their getting stuck in the snow in our black uniforms in front of tanks. Well, what a great deal. Contrary to all expectations, everything went well. Besides, we were certainly better off than the comrades who, in their panzer uniforms, were employed as infantry. Full of jealousy, we repeatedly saw how well Ivan was equipped in contrast to us. We were really happy when a few replacement battalions finally reached us from the home front. The 10th Company was completely resupplied with vehicles, and I could finally take over my platoon. From March until the end of June 1942, we slugged it out in a defensive fighting with the Russians around our winter positions of Kahansk and each of Vyazma. We were then transferred to the area around Shcheveska, where we joined in the offensive fighting east of Bolozh. I was put in for a promotion during this fighting, and a few days after the promotion, something happened where I almost had to take my new shoulder straps off again. My platoon was positioned along a wooded trail. "Nice area," my driver said, and he was right. There was no visibility in front of or behind us. Everywhere was just fucking trees and bushes. No man's land began on the other side of the trail. There was a pack next to us, somewhat offset. The few infantrymen were divided among us. The drivers and loaders of my 4 tanks had just gone to fetch the meal. My thoughts were already drifting to chow when the fireworks went off and the Russians attacked. Half of the crews were missing. No tank was ready for combat. I panicked at that point, slid into the driver's seat, and backed out of the woods. The other tanks in my platoon followed me in the belief that radio communications had failed. They were following the order to do exactly what the platoon leader's tank did whenever something like that occurred. After we had driven a few hundred meters, it was clear to me I had engineered a mess. The pack crew and the handful of infantrymen had probably lost their nerves when they saw me bug out. I quickly turned around and returned to the old position. Those great guys in the foxholes had held their nerves and had already repulsed the attack. "Man, what a bunch of heroes," the pack commander said. "If that's all you can handle, then you're better off not even coming back to the front." I stood there with my tail between my legs and could only assure him that something like that would never happen again. That experience still weighed heavily on my mind for many days afterwards. How easy it is to make such a hasty decision, how badly it could have ended. It should have stayed there, of course, even if we weren't quite... I should have stayed there, of course, even if we weren't quite combat ready. That had become clear to me after a few minutes, but the mistake had already been made when we cranked up. This episode was a damned good lesson for me, and I always reminded myself of it, especially when I had to pass judgment on subordinates. I was happy that I had the opportunity to wipe the slate clean before our units transfer to the area north of Orel. By doing that, I could at least wait for my promotion with a clearer conscience. Before I received my promotion, however, I was destined to get acquainted with a special area of operations. I became the leader of the engineer platoon in the headquarters company for a short time. Chapter 6, A Catastrophe.
Hey, say hi, Stella.
Yeah. All right, you ready to listen to one more stories? You ready to listen to one more stories? We were in our bunkers far behind the front. One morning, the commander called to me excitedly. "Hey, Carius, take a look, just like in the movies. How is such a thing possible?" A newly equipped Luftwaffe field division advanced just past our quarters on the way to the front. It took my breath away, just like a fairy tale. From the bread bags to the cannons, everything was new. We saw weapons we had only heard rumors about. The MG-42, the 75mm long-barreled pack, and other amazing things. Certainly nothing could happen here. We wanted to believe that we would finally be able to refit our units as well. Everything that was rolling toward the front was a guarantee for a peaceful winter in this sector. Naturally, our company commander was itching to be able to see all the nice things up close, so we drove to the front lines to recon the situation. A dignified atmosphere prevailed. We thought we were in a training area. The non-commissioned officers wore their elegant visor caps, the troops were clueless and a bit bored in their positions. There were absolutely no signs of life. Because of that, they had also packed away the MG-42s, so nothing would get into them. The comrades simply couldn't be convinced to demonstrate these previously unknown wonder weapons to us just once. An uncomfortable feeling crept over us. What would happen if Ivan were to attack here? Before these weapons were combat ready, the Russians would have already overrun the position. Our fears would soon be justified. A dull rolling from the northeast woke us one morning. We strained our ears for a few minutes. Then nothing could keep us in our bunkers anymore. Outside, an icy snowstorm practically took our breath away and almost blew us over. That was ideal attack weather for the Russians. Without waiting for the alarm, we woke up the company. Our suspicions were confirmed. The report soon came that the Russians had broken through. We found the commander of the Luftwaffe division in a state of complete despair at his command post. He didn't know where his units were. The Russian tanks had rolled over everything before the pack guns had even fired a shot. Ivan had captured the brand new material, and the division had scattered to the four winds. Fortunately, the enemy stood fast after his quick initial victory. He feared a trap. Thus, with some effort, our regiment was able to seal off the breakthrough. It was a complete madhouse. When one infantry unit marched up to a village, men in Luftwaffe uniforms waved to it. Shortly afterwards, they opened fire with devastating effectiveness. The Russians were wearing the captured winter clothing. We thus received the order to shoot at every Luftwaffe uniform, since only Russians could be lurking in them. Unfortunately, a few of our own isolated assault groups also fell victim to this cruel order. Whenever we heard an MG-42 hammer away in the next few days and weeks, we could bet our lives on it that the fucking Russians were firing it. We still hadn't used the brand new weapon in action, and our foot soldiers usually had to be contented with captured Russian weapons. We all became enraged whenever we thought about the failure of those responsible. They put the best weapons into the hands of completely inexperienced, poorly trained troops and threw them straight to the front. How well we could have used this men and material, intelligently employed in the following weeks in the offensive and defensive fighting south of Beloshka-Shnaisky. I survived a particularly nasty action as a newly baked lieutenant and engineer platoon leader. We had the mission to clear the mines ahead of the tanks. I was amazed that I got away with only a superficial flesh wound on the hand, and then started to appreciate the work that was demanded from our engineers. I was happy when I transferred back to our old first company. I saw August Daller again, my old tank commander. He had become a Feldwebel in the meantime, and naturally we rode together in the same platoon. The operations we jointly participated in brought about the greatest losses to our battalion since the beginning of the campaign. The Russians employed great quantities of anti-tank rifles, which penetrated our tanks with ease. Our losses were very high. Many of our comrades were mortally wounded in their tanks, or could only be evacuated with serious wounds. We were completely helpless in night engagements. The Russians let us approach quite close, and by the time we recognized them, it was much too late to defend ourselves, especially since an exact laying of the tank sights was impossible at night. The feeling of being practically defenseless got to us. Fortunately, the first 75mm long-barreled Mark IVs and the more heavily armored 50mm long-barreled Mark IIIs started to arrive in small quantities from the home front. That was the silver lining on the horizon, a lining which would so often let our hopes be revived in Russia. Our practically giving up hope and losing all confidence in our own vehicles, we again gathered some courage and made it through the last unsuccessful attack through Polashka on Belyeva. In the meantime, it had become January 1943. I was supposed to take my home front leave before the upcoming leave cancellations. On the evening before my departure, August Deller motioned his tank out of its box. It had been dug into the earth to ward against the enormous cold. Deller slipped on the smooth, sloped ramp with his felt boots and slid in front of the left track of the vehicle. It grabbed him without his driver noticing it. The tank was immediately brought to a stop when the remainder of the crew yelled, but the track had already rolled up Deller's upper thigh. He was killed immediately, without even having uttered a sound. I had lost one of my best friends. I was then really ready for leave and looked forward to home in my parents' house, but it seemed as if I were not supposed to enjoy my time there. A telegram soon arrived, announcing my transfer to the 500th Replacement Battalion. Disappointed, I kept on guessing why I could not return to my old company. I reached Potlos with mixed feelings and with a certain expectation of having to go through another gunnery course. I would much rather have returned to my old gang at the front. Not until I reported to headquarters did I discover that the officers with frontline experience and a few companies from the Eastern Front were supposed to be trained there on a new type of tank, the Tiger. The news spread like wildfire, and yet no one knew anything specific about it. We got to view a few of its precursors from development, but we didn't like them very much. Hauptmann von Lützow was supposed to lead the training. I knew him from Russia and didn't think it was very nice of him that he saddled me with the job of running the officers' club. There was probably no more junior officer to be found. Therefore, I couldn't change anything. Nishfabel. That this job would bring me luck later was something I didn't discover until much later. We went to Paderborn, the home of the 500th Replacement and Training Battalion, which was later responsible for all units with Tigers. As the club officer, I met Hauptmann Stober. He had come from Russia with his company for retraining. Von Lützow had given me strict orders to accommodate Stober's every wish concerning the allocation of alcoholic drinks. We were both close friends. Stober liked to drink a drop or two every now and then. He showed up at my location almost daily since I had to control the scarce supplies. We thus came to know and respect one another. I had the feeling that he liked me, not only because of his special allotment of French Flamand. We often sat together with the men of his company as well. I was especially happy when he asked me one day, "Carius, how would you like it if you were to come to my company?" "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." I could scarcely believe my luck. Only 2 companies were initially being organized. At most, only 6 men were required from the entire group of officers, and I was one of them. On my recommendation, Schober took Oberleutnant von Schiller for his executive officer. I knew him from the 21st Regiment. I was finally relieved of my post as the club officer soon after my transfer. to the new company. Schober had consumed quite a bit. I must also consider that he had also supplied his company with spirits in the process. When a few bottles were demanded for the reception of some sort of higher-up, I had to respectfully report there wasn't a single drop left. Oh well, my successor didn't need to accept any stock. The transfer was easy. I could begin to devote myself entirely to the company. When Schober introduced me to them, I couldn't help but recall the comments made by my fellow travelers when I was called up. I will never forget the eyes made by Hauptfabel Rieger and Oberfabel Delzit. They later confessed their first impressions of me. It could be summed up in the following statement. "Man, Sepp, what kind of little fart did the old man dredge up?" Naturally, it was difficult to find trust in a combat company as an outsider, but everything went well. Even before our departure to France, we were supposed to get our Tigers. I had become very tight with those guys, as if I had always been with them. Unfortunately, Hauptmann Schober was summoned to take over a battalion. His departure speech stayed with me for a long time and became an inspiration to me. He requested the men to show me the same trust as they did to him. I dedicated myself with heart and soul to my duty. After a few months of training, we had surpassed the other companies in the battalion with regard to our successes. In the process, we had the least number of mechanical failures. I had not dared to hope for that when Schober handed over the company to Hauptmann Radke. Hauptmann Ome led me to the 3rd Company. The 1st Company had been collecting experience as an experimental company in the northern sector of the Eastern Front since the autumn of 1942. After our activation, we were supposed to follow them into the area around Leningrad. Chapter 7. In Brittany. Initially, however, we headed west to Clermont in Brittany. The company was directed to an abandoned and neglected chateau. The company commander and the executive officer lived by themselves in the city. I had preferred to live with the company. We had to get to know one another, especially if we were supposed to go into action together. The company never forgot what I did. I gladly took all the unpleasantness in stride that I had to accept in the small, musty room of our beloved castle. The fun began as soon as we moved in. We had to put the old stables in order before we could be expected to live there. There was neither a wooden floor nor wooden planks. For the time being, I wanted to get hold of a few bales of straw for my men, but in the neighboring farm they refused to give me anything without a receipt from the local headquarters. I thus drove to the headquarters in the city, but they had already closed up shop. I promptly filled out a certificate to the farmer myself so he could file a complaint about it. Just as promptly came the dressing down from the battalion. If we hadn't departed for the Eastern Front soon thereafter, they probably would have saddled me with the proceedings for plunder or something similar. After the war, I often had to think that, whenever I saw how easily the French occupation troops simply covered their needs through us. During this period, I also had to add a war crime to my conscience, an execution without trial or judgment. I was the next one up during live firing at the edge of town, when the rooster of a neighboring farm ran straight across the range. More than likely, it had been directed that farm animals were supposed to be pinned in during the firing. I had just taken aim when the rooster crossed between me and the target. The commander yelled something out, but it was too late. I couldn't help myself. I gave up on the target rings to make the rooster a source of amusement for us all. It made a few somersaults, and then it became something scarcely edible. The company commander was already giving me a huge dressing down when the grieving owner of the dearly departed rooster also came running up. Even with money, she couldn't be calmed down, since the deceased was plainly been the best rooster far and wide. Of course, the red wine was a part of our stay in France as well. The Austrians in the company were especially partial to it. There was hardly an evening where I didn't have to get up again and put my Austrians to bed. The charge of quarters usually wasn't able to impose lights out, since more than half of the company were non-commissioned officers who pulled duty as drivers, gunners, and tank commanders. I almost always had to personally announce closing time, but usually that didn't happen until I had drained the glass offered to me and listened to a Viennese song. We didn't take the obligatory drill and ceremonies too seriously. We simply went through the motions whenever a superior came into view, so that we wouldn't stick out too noticeably. Besides, I was happy to be able to experience a few carefree days before we went back to the front. Soon the transportation details were formed to fetch the tigers from Germany. One of these details was entrusted to me. I had a layover in Paris, both coming and going. The city and its inhabitants were very interesting to me. Although it was difficult to get a conversation going with them, I admired the attitude of the French. God knows they had really lost the war, but not a word was said against their own soldiers. They also refrained from any type of criticism against us. To dirty one's own name after losing a war seemed to remain a trait of the Germans. Our troops in Paris acted as if the war had already ended and been won. This behavior was unbelievable to me. I wasn't able to forget that in a few weeks we would be slugging it out with the Russians again. Chapter 9. Portrait of the Tiger. Naturally, our thoughts were occupied with the new tank on our return journey. How would the Tiger perform? Its outer form was anything but pretty and pleasing. It looked plump. Almost all of the flat surfaces were horizontal. Only the front slope was welded obliquely. Thicker armor compensated for the elimination of round shapes. The irony isn't lost when one discovered that we had delivered the large hydraulic presses to the Russians shortly before the war, which they had manufactured the so elegantly rounded off surfaces of their T-34s and 43s. Our armament experts had placed no value in it. In their opinion, such thick armor would never ever be needed. As a result, we had to put up with flat surfaces. Even if our Tiger wasn't just beautiful, its robustness would fill us with enthusiasm. It really drove just like a car. With 2 fingers, we could literally shift 700 horsepower, steer 60 tons, drive 45 kilometers an hour on roads, and trek 20 kilometers an hour cross country. In consideration of the equipment, however, we only drove 20 to 25 kilometers on the roads and correspondingly slower cross country. Obviously, the greatest responsibility for the readiness of the vehicle fell to the driver. The man really had to be top notch. He had to drive using his head and not his rear end. If he was on his toes, then his Tiger never left him in the lurch. The really good tank driver, and no other type was let loose on a Tiger, also had to have an instinctive feel for the terrain. He had to move properly cross country. He always had to keep the tank's best side facing the enemy, without the tank commander giving him every move first. Only then was it possible for a tank commander to concentrate completely on the enemy, and only then could a platoon commander or company commander properly direct his vehicles in an operation without having to pay constant attention to the terrain. The tank driver position also demanded a generous helping of guts. He was, after all, the only man in the vehicle who saw a lot, yet had to remain completely passive whenever the tank was under fire and the rest of the crew slugged it out with the enemy. In those instances, he helped by observing and had to rely completely on his comrades in the turret. Properties of a tank driver described above make it understandable that not all tank commanders came from the ranks of the gunners, but rather from those of the drivers. For example, Kircher and Link, to name only 2 commanders, had been drivers first. My old reliable, Karl Barasch, also immediately took over my seat as tank commander after I was wounded in 1944. The reader must permit me to present some interesting information in order to show how the work was in no way through after the operation. For all of us, especially for the driver, it really only began then, so that we could be in shape the next day. The fuel tanks held 530 liters. That's 27 canisters of 20 liters or 3 barrels. With that quantity, we could travel exactly 80 kilometers cross country. The maintenance of the batteries was important, especially in winter. They had to be constantly charged up by letting the motor run whenever we didn't drive a lot. Otherwise, the starter didn't turn over the engine anymore. If that happened, 2 of the crew members had to climb out and crank over the engine with an inertial starter similar to those on old aircraft, only at the rear. Doesn't take too much imagination to realize that doing that was no great thrill in the middle of a battle and in view of the enemy. Despite that, it sometimes happened that the batteries were too weak, and at the front, we soon found an elegant method to avoid having to climb out. A neighboring tank was called over. It turned its cannon to the rear and slowly approached the rear of the front tank. The straddled tank was pushed, and the motor usually reported after the first few meters. The radio equipment, the inner and outer lights, the ventilator, the electrical ignition for the cannon were dependent upon the batteries. It was understandable then that their maintenance was of great importance. A water radiator with 120-liter capacity and 4 fans took over cooling the engine. The cooling grills on the rear deck, absolutely necessary so warm air could be extracted, were often the reason that tanks became disabled by otherwise harmless rounds or shrapnel. They damaged the radiators that were underneath. The motor held 28 liters of oil, the transmission 30 liters, the reduction gears 12 liters, the turret power system 5 liters, and the ventilation motors 7 liters. A pair of large air filters caught the dust. When one considers that on a move of only 7 kilometers, 170,000 liters of air were sucked into the engine, while the dust of almost 4 acres of land was stirred up, the quantity a person could breathe in 10 days if he were to sit on the rear deck in the dustiest spot, then it is understandable that the cleaning of air filters was necessary before every move. With a regularly clean filter, Everyone could get 5,000 kilometers of operation on a single motor. If the filters were covered with dirt, we couldn't get 500. 4 dual carburetors fed the motor and controlled it through a governor. The sensitivity of the carburetors was the greatest disadvantage of the German gasoline motors in comparison with the robust diesel engines of the Russians. On the other hand, a greater resilience was the advantage of the German tank engine. The transmission, which functioned semi-automatically, had 8 forward and 4 rear gears. The steering gears enabled the power taken away from the one track and steering to be transferred to the other. In turning in place, one track ran forward and the other backward. This power was negated by steering brakes on the Panzer I through the Panzer IV. The Tiger driver, however, sat up at the steering wheel and could direct the 63 tons as easily as a car. Up to then, a lot of strength had been necessary in steering a tank. The overlapping suspension had 8 axles on each side. Each axle had 3 road wheels, which ran on the track and supported it at the same time. The lighter types of German tanks, on the other hand, had both road wheels and support rollers. Just imagine how many road wheels on the Tiger had to be removed whenever one of the inner ones had to be changed. The 22-liter motor performed best at 2,600 revolutions per minute. At 3,000, it soon became far too hot. Before loading the tanks on trains, the cross-country track had to be exchanged with a narrower one. Otherwise, it extended over the sides of the cars and would have endangered oncoming traffic. Special 6-axle cars had been constructed for rail transportation. They carried 80 tons and accompanied each battalion into the area of operations. In order not to endanger any railway bridges, at least 4 other freight cars had to be placed between 2 Tigers. The turret was turned by a hydraulic gearbox. The gunner's feet rested on a tilting platform. If he pressed the tip of his foot towards the front, the turret turned towards the right. If he pressed with his sole towards the rear, it turned to the left. The more he pressed in the corresponding direction, the faster the movement. At its slowest, a 360-degree revolution of the weapon in the turret took 60 minutes. At its quickest, it took 60 seconds. Extreme aiming accuracy was thus ensured. The practiced gunner didn't need to adjust afterwards with his hand. Because of the electrical ignition of the cannon, slight pressure by the little finger sufficed to let loose a round. The unavoidable jumping, usually caused when pulling the trigger by mechanical methods, was thus avoided. Our most dangerous opponents in Russia were the T-34 and the T-43, which were equipped with long-barreled 76.2 millimeter cannons. The tanks were dangerous to us from 600 meters in the rear, 1,500 meters in the sides, and as far as 1,800 meters in the rear. If we hit these enemy tanks in the right place, we could still destroy them at 900 meters with our 800 millimeter cannon. The Stalin tank, which we first got to know in 1944, was at very minimum the equal of the Tiger. It was considerably superior in its shape, just like the T-34. I won't describe the KV-1, the KV-85, the other less frequently encountered types of enemy tanks, the assault guns with their larger caliber cannons in detail here. A completely outfitted Tiger company had 14 tanks. Its firepower was thus greater than that of an entire flak battalion, 3 batteries with 4 guns each. The production costs of one Tiger ran to not quite 1 million Reichsmarks. For that reason, only a few heavy tank battalions were organized. To be the commander of such a company meant carrying a considerable responsibility. And I think that's where we will wrap it up for today. Hope you guys enjoy the content.